In the heart of the 16th century, Europe was a boiling cauldron of religious and political turmoil. On May 6, 1527, Rome, the eternal city and the spiritual heart of the Catholic Church, was plunged into a nightmare of violence and chaos that would leave an indelible mark on history. The sack of Rome, as it came to be known, was a brutal event that exposed the deep-seated tensions and corruption within the Catholic Church and the wider European society. This essay will explore the events leading up to the sack of Rome, the horrors that unfolded during the 8 months of pillage and destruction, and the long-lasting impact it had on the Catholic Church and the Protestant Reformation. The seeds of the sack of Rome were sown in the ill-disciplined, famished, and unpaid troops of Emperor Charles V. These soldiers, who had already defeated King Francis I of France and crossed the Alps, were now at large in northern Italy, hungry and desperate. Leading this ragtag army was the Constable de Bourbon, a French nobleman who had turned against his own king and joined the imperial forces. The core of this army was made up of Landsknecht, German mercenaries, known for their ferocity and lack of discipline. As they marched through Italy, the defenders of the cities they encountered heard a chilling cry that would soon strike fear across Europe, the roaring "Hoch, hoch" of the charging German infantry. These Landsknecht, many of whom were Protestants, had a deep-seated disdain for the Catholic Church, which they saw as a corrupt and heretical institution. However, their primary motivation was greed. They had been promised the chance to plunder and ransom the rich cities of Florence and Rome, and they were determined to make the most of it. Charles V, the emperor who had hired these troops, was unaware of their true intentions. His own reverence for the papacy led him to grant his enemies an 8-month armistice in exchange for 60,000 ducats to be distributed among his troops. But the money was not enough to quell their hunger for loot and revenge. Enraged and feeling betrayed, the imperial army mutinied and set their sights on the capital of Christendom. On May 6, 1527, the imperial army broke through the defenses of Rome. The first to fall was the Constable de Bourbon, killed by a sniper on the Roman walls. His death marked the beginning of a catastrophic 8-month period of pillage, murder, and destruction. The mutineers, now leaderless and driven by their basest instincts, rampaged through the city, pillaging house after house, murdering anyone who stood in their way. Buildings were set ablaze, and the screams of the victims filled the air. Pope Clement VII and a few of his closest advisors managed to find refuge in the fortress of Castel Sant'Angelo, narrowly escaping by lowering themselves over the walls in baskets. But the rest of the population was left to the mercy of the rampaging soldiers. The scenes that unfolded in Rome were BEYOND, Chinese letter. Women of all ages were raped in the streets, nuns were rounded up and forced into brothels, and priests were brutally assaulted. Civilians were massacred, and the streets ran red with blood. After the first week of uncontrolled violence, over 2,000 bodies were floating in the Tiber River, and nearly 10,000 more awaited burial. The city, once a symbol of civilization and culture, was transformed into a reeking slaughterhouse. The soldiers had come for money, and they got it. Between 3 million and 4 million, ducats were extorted in ransoms alone. The rich were tortured for their wealth, and those who could pay were eventually freed. Those who could not pay were tortured to death in the most gruesome ways, but the looting did not stop there. No source of treasure was overlooked. Tombs were desecrated for their jewels, and relics were stripped of their precious covers. Monasteries, palaces, and churches were ransacked for their treasures. The Vatican itself was not spared. It was turned into a stable, and the archives and libraries were burned, with manuscript pages used as bedding for horses. The soldiers also engaged in acts of desecration, for the sheer joy of it. They donned the red hats and vestments of cardinals, parodying holy rites. One drunk Landsknecht even rode an ass while wearing the pontiff's vestments, mocking the sacred rituals of the church. The violence and destruction continued for 8 months, until the food supplies ran out and a plague began to spread. Only then did the mutineers withdraw, leaving behind a city in ruins and a population traumatized by the horrors they had witnessed. As news of the sack of Rome spread across Europe, reactions were mixed. Protestants saw it as a divine act of retribution for the corruption and tyranny of the papal court. Some Catholics agreed. recognizing that the Church had brought this disaster upon itself through its own failings. Cardinal Cajetan, who had met Martin Luther in Augsburg 9 years earlier, wrote with a heavy heart, "We who should have been the salt of the earth have decayed until we are good for nothing beyond outward ceremonials." However, most members of the Catholic hierarchy saw it differently. They viewed the sack of Rome as a clear threat from Protestant heresy, and vowed to respond with equal vigor, intolerance, and brutality. The Catholic Church's response to the sack of Rome was a turning point in the history of the Reformation. Instead of addressing the internal issues that had driven good Christians to leave the Church, the Vatican committed itself to reaction, repression, and military action against those who had left. Jews, often the scapegoats in times of crisis, were blamed and confined to ghettos in Rome, forced to wear the Star of David. Catholic princes were persuaded to wage war in the name of the Savior, or even send assassins to eliminate Protestant nobles. Every aspect of Protestantism, from the doctrine of justification by faith alone to the exaltation of the Lord's Supper and the propriety of clerical marriage, was condemned in a series of papal bulls. Despite these efforts, the Protestant faith continued to spread. In 1530, Charles V, under pressure from the Curia, signed a decree directing the Imperial Chamber of Justice to take legal action against princes who had appropriated ecclesiastical property. The princes were given 6 months to comply, but none did. The stage was set for more conflict and bloodshed. The sack of Rome was a pivotal event that exposed the deep divisions and corruption within the Catholic Church. It also marked a significant shift in the dynamics of the Protestant Reformation. The Church's response to the sack of Rome, characterized by repression and military action, only served to further alienate those who had already left and harden the resolve of those who remained. The world, still lit only by fire, seemed to be enveloped in a cycle of violence and retribution, with true saints on both sides of the conflict becoming martyrs in the flames. In the end, the sack of Rome was a tragic and brutal event that left an indelible mark on the history of Europe. It serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked corruption, greed, and violence, and the importance of addressing the root causes of social and religious conflict. As we look back on this dark chapter in history, we must remember the lessons it teaches and strive to build a more just and compassionate world.